Okay, so in the last video I made some of the connections and political underpinnings related to the George H.W. Bush years. I would like to move ahead in the Clinton administration at this point, but we need to finish up some of the significant international events that Bush 41 was responsible for, and now how his particular events that Bush 41 eventually directly connects to Clinton and is intrinsically connected to how it was that Clinton became the Democratic nominee in '92. In 1990, before the Gulf War, we already talked about in the last video, H.W. Bush sent military forces into Panama City, Panama, presumably because Manuel Noriega was a brutal dictator, and we, the United States, with any international law from which to support such an invasion, needed to capture him and bring him to justice for crimes against his people and for getting his breaking U.S. law by trafficking in cocaine. The entire Panama City affair was, of course, beyond absurd and a violation of international law. The U.S. cannot charge a foreign leader with committing a crime against U.S. law and thereby kidnap him and put him in prison. H.W. 41, of course, knew he could use crimes against his people to remove the UN Security Council from having a vote. The larger body at the UN was largely silent for the face of no Security Council vote. This saga played out in 1990 begins all the way back to the Nixon administration. H.W. 41 was head of the CIA from 71 to 79. During the beginning of his tenure as CIA director in 72, Manuel Noriega finds himself in a military coup launched by him and his loyal commanders within the military and becomes the undisputed autocratic dictator of Panama. H.W. Bush, eager to begin a conduit of cocaine trafficking from Colombia into the U.S., began black channels with Noriega in an effort to try and see if the newly installed dictator might be agreeable in high-stakes cocaine processing and money laundering in Panama. The agreement between H.W. Bush and Noriega are, of course, unknown, but we do know some. The cocaine would be brought to Panama by Colombian drug cartels, and once in Panama, Noriega would have to process the drugs into the powder form and launder the money through Panamanian banks. A very well-known open secret during the 70s, 92s, and 80s, the Panama banks were havens for offshore banking shelters and many drug laundering. We need to make some connections between Clinton, H.W. Bush, and Noriega before we going on. In 73, Clinton becomes the governor of Arkansas, and H.W. Bush makes the newly elected governor a proposal he couldn't resist. Once the cocaine production was up and running in Panama, H.W. Bush needed a distribution outlet within the U.S. In comes Governor Clinton. The reason H.W. Bush reaches out to Clinton is because he already knew that Clinton was compromised because of his own drug habit. H.W. Bush proposes to Clinton that if he would receive the loads of cocaine from Panama into Mena, Arkansas, a National Guard Air Force base under the direct authority of the governor, he, Clinton, would then direct the loads of cocaine to be distributed throughout the entire U.S. from Mena. I'll come back to the Clinton-H.W. Bush relationship in a moment, but first I want to finish up with what happened in 1990 with the military action in Panama City. From the early 70s and 92s, as noted, H.W. Bush and Noriega had agreed upon this drug trafficking operation. In 88, the same year Bush was elected to the presidency, the crack explosion begins to take root in the inner cities throughout the nation. In an effort to keep up with the emerging trend, H.W. Bush in 1990 instructs Noriega he must now turn the cocaine into crack instead of powder. According to the Noriega, the processing of cocaine into crack is more expensive and demands more money to do it. Bush tells him, "I'm not paying you any more money," and to do the change, Noriega stops the conduit of planes into Mena, Arkansas. CNN broadcast the military operation live as the helicopters flew into Panamanian City and hovered over the cathedral in Panama City. Noriega realizes he has made a very bad miscalculation with trying to strong-arm the now President Bush. He races predictably to the cathedral in Panama City, where the helicopters already knew his whereabouts and hovered above the church for 3 hours. Why? Noriega must contact the only man on the planet who can save him from Bush. Bush in the White House Situation Room is waiting to give the go-ahead, and the helicopters to defend and pull Noriega out of must wait for a phone call. Bush already knows the call will come at some point, but cannot make a move until it does. Who is the call coming from? The Pope. John Paul II is the only man on the face of the earth that can save Noriega. So if the Pope says to Bush, "You can get him," Bush will leave and it's over. But if he says, "I don't care, whatever you want," then Bush will direct the helicopters to descend to the ground, drag out Noriega. Well, 3 hours in waiting to broadcast television news, we saw the helicopters descend down, drag Noriega, just like obviously the call came in and the Pope said, "Whatever you want." Bush directs the military to transport Noriega to Miami, throw him in a cell where he sat for 26 years until 2016 when he was released and died some 8 months later. No trial, no anything, all because he would not traffic drugs all along at what he's been doing. Let's get back to the H.W. Bush-Clinton relationship for a moment so we can examine the political connections that propelled a little-known governor from the poorest state in the U.S. into presidential politics as the Democratic nominee in 1992 to run against H.W. Bush. As the previous video explained, the economy was in recession during the Bush presidency, so he took action with the Gulf War in an effort to stop it. Because the economic conditions were still persistently unavoidable after the war, Bush understood that the likelihood of securing a second term was doubtful and unrealistic assumption given the political climate in the nation. Bush would manage to broker a political arrangement not heard of in presidential politics. Bush, operating on the assumption he was not going to win, but as a sitting president would be the Republican nominee all the same, decided if he wasn't going to win, that why not pick the next president himself. The sitting president from the White House in February '92 began secret negotiations with the chairman of the DNC to sacrifice the election if he, Bush, could name the nominee for the DNC. The DNC, without objection, agreed to the selection of Governor Clinton of Arkansas. He was a longtime close friend and associate of the president and also controllable because of the ongoing drug trafficking operations he was still overseeing. Bush wanted to keep the drug coming, so if he meant throwing the election to Clinton, so be it. As President Clinton would be much more able to distribute the drugs, Bush was not just interested in drug trade, he also was more importantly interested in the trade agreement Congress had failed to deliver on. The agreement to have Clinton as the DNC nominee was critical to this agreement. The agreement was called NAFTA, and Clinton promised Bush he would implement it as part of the arrangement that made him president. In '91, on September 11th, Bush gave the speech to the nation in a joint session of Congress called the 1,000 Points of Light speech, where he laid out the New World Order agenda. 10 years later to the day, Towers' event would begin to rapidly accelerate the New World Order through the military ambitions of his oldest son, George W. Bush. Now you can see a clearer picture of the connections between political parties, as they often have a very same objectives. In the election of '92, Clinton won the White House but failed to secure a majority in the House. Clinton, eager to deliver on his promise to implement NAFTA, secured a quick passage in the Senate and a narrow victory in the House, though bipartisan efforts. After the NAFTA agreements were official, Clinton's legislative agenda was forestalled by the right-wing ultra-conservatives led by the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and his contract with American majority in the House. The impact on Clinton's first 2 years in office was disastrous. Without any ability to pass legislation, Clinton began to focus on a compromise in the '93 September 1st fiscal year '94 budget resolution. The conservative GOP would not agree on the budget Clinton continued to submit and then veto once they threw it back on his desk. Without a significant legislative success thus far and an unlikely reconciliation of the '94 budget impasse, Clinton decided against all odds to shut the government down if the GOP would not accept his budget. The country was outraged and shocked at the shutting down of the government, but the nation placed the blame on the GOP. Clinton gambled successfully that he would make such a move and that people would see the GOP for what they were and score huge midterm election results in the DNC. Now we should switch focus onto the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, and what sort of operation she was inclined to involve herself in. By the midterm elections of '94, the DNC secured a majority in both houses of Congress, and Clinton, for his part, was now becoming a very popular president with legislative victories during the next 2 years. Hillary in '94 began her singular attempt at national health care that unfortunately for her was a catastrophic failure. We need to try and understand the First Lady from a different perspective rather than one that would cast her as a noble architect of a national health care fiasco. In '94, that same year, throughout the next 3 years until '97, the leaks coming out of the White House were beyond outrageous. Scandals from Travelgate to Whitewater to an almost legendary press office briefing that was regularly having their questions being directed to the Justice Department. Here, we must take a closer look at the Attorney General, Janet Reno. Hillary Clinton wanted Janet Reno to be the Attorney General because she is easily controllable and had skeletons in her closet. Janet Reno was a prosecutor in the Miami-Dade County Prosecutor's Office prior to becoming Attorney General. A few years before the '92 elections in '87, Janet was found in a parking lot and an underage girl having sex in the Miami police. Hillary knew about the incident because the district attorney's office did not charge Janet with the sex crime. It's entirely understood how exactly Hillary was aware of the incident, but it seems likely to be that both Hillary and Janet are lesbians. Hillary is likely bisexual, and the two likely did not have any sort of sexual relationship. This is a blurry political arrangement to appoint Janet as the AG in Clinton's cabinet. Hillary, the criminal of the Clintons, knew that she would be doing all sorts of activities that needed to insulate the president and the first lady. How exactly does the attorney general insulate the White House? The scandals were obviously coming out of the White House and, more importantly, the West Wing specifically. If the attorney general is already aware that she is the point guard on everything leaking out of the White House, then she is in control of the FBI, can it, by her own authority, begin and terminate investigations. This way, the first couple would their authority over the AG begin and terminate investigation. This way, the first couple would never be directly connected to the investigations. If the President and the First Lady were to use their authority over the AG, and the House Select Oversight Committee would easily know that. After 2 years of this going on, the House did in '96, the same year Clinton is running for a second term, appoint a special prosecutor to investigate the never-ending leaker and scandals coming out of the White House. Kenneth Starr was the special prosecutor, and he is appointed after the House Oversight Committee had enough of the Attorney General's inability to find criminality on the ongoing outrageous activities. That year, Clinton won an easy victory to a second term as the country seemed oblivious to the outrageous scandals coming out of the White House. Kenneth Starr continues his investigations into '96 and realizes something very big. These leaks are confined to the White House. Starr knows that. But more importantly, he understands they are specifically confined to the West Wing of the White House. Such is the reason he continues to suspect Bill, but can find nothing. Why? Hillary was the First Lady that refused the East Wing of the White House, but rather wanted her office instead to be next to her husband's. Secret Service tells the story like this. One morning in '96, Hillary is coming down the hall of the West Wing past the Oval, and then past her Chief of Staff office, Vince Foster's, on her way to hers. As she passes Vince's office, she notices something on his desk and thinks she knows what it is. She grabs the paper off his desk and opens it. It is a subpoena for Vince to come in and testify, or he goes to jail. Hillary understands what this means. Either he talks or she goes to jail. The very next thing the news reports is that Vince Foster's dead body was found right across the street from the White House in a parking lot, a suicide note labeled Susan. Hillary simply picked up the phone and had a car diverted into the park on his way to work and had him killed. The D.C. cops were removed off the investigation by the Attorney General and had the FBI put it to rule it suicide. There are 46 dead bodies, all ruled suicide, connected to Hillary Clinton and her crimes, yes. 2 years later, the wife of Vincent went on TV, said she's sure that he was murdered because the 38 years of marriage he never called her Susan. Obviously, Hillary and her assassins would not know that fact, hence the note labeled Susan instead of Susie. Hillary very quickly shreds all the evidence and is unfortunately unavailable to testify. Vince is unfortunately unavailable to testify because he's dead and the investigation is over. Kenneth Starr is not finished with his continuing investigations into Bill, however. In 1994 and '96 would be incredibly difficult years for Bill because of the breakdown of the Balkans of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia. The ethnic cleansing and genocide of Bosnia strongman Milosevic would manage to put international relations front and center rather than with the White House investigations. The Attorney General was managing to handle most of the investigations throughout those years. In '97, Starr begins a grand jury indictment against the president for improper sexual relations with the White House intern Monica Lewinsky. The Republican majority in the House moves to impeach Clinton. The scandal would cripple the administration for the rest of '97 and '98 onto the summer when the Democratic caucus in total defense the president, and it seems to be that the nation as a whole was in solidarity with him. The sexual misconduct seems to raise anything like public moral outrage, but rather political infighting. In the last 2 years of Clinton's term in '99-2000, he would enjoy some minor legislative wins, but two very big important events would cement his legacy into the history books. From the beginning of the second term in '97, with the specter of the Monica Lewinsky scandal looming, the president, in his credit, never stopped doing his job throughout the '97-2000 with respect to the budget. Clinton is the first U.S. president that not only eliminated the national debt, but actually he generated a surplus. This was an unbelievable achievement, considering what he was up against. The reasons for exactly why he did this monumental action was not entirely magnanimous. I told you when H.W. Bush originally positioned Clinton to take the '92 election, he did so with the very specific promise for Clinton that he would implement NAFTA, and he had to remove the Glass-Steagall Act. This law was put into place to protect us from another Great Depression. By removing it, the casino banks like Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch want to merge up with the regular banks like Bank of America and Citibank can merge and work under one roof. His economic brilliance was to back up the economy so well that he could protect his legacy before he died. The 2007 crisis was the full-on equity freeze was a direct result of the removal of this law. Clinton did that in 2000, the last month of his last year in office. Also, to talk about some domestic considerations, in February 20th, 93, the Waco siege, ATF had planned their raid for Monday, March 1st, 93, with the code name Showtime. The ATF would later claim that this raid was moved up a day on February 28th, 93, in response to the Waco Tribune-Herald, The Sinful Messiah, series of articles which the ATF had tried to prevent from being published. Beginning February 1st, ATF agents had 3 meetings with the Tribune-Herald. Staff regarded a delay in publication of The Sinful Messiah. The paper was first told by the ATF that the raid would take place February 22nd, which they soon after changed to March the 1st, and then ultimately to indefinite date. ATF agents felt this newspaper had held off publication at the request of the ATF for at least 3 weeks. In a February 24th meeting between Tribune-Herald staff and ATF agent Philip Konachak and 2 other agents, allegedly the children had been physically and sexually abused long before the standoff. Attacks on the compound to force the Branch Davidians out. Ultimately, the FBI and the ATF, at the behest of Janet Reno, would begin to forcibly engage with the Branch Davidians inside the compound on April 19, 93, and what was up until this point what would become what appears to be the standard procedure for the Attorney General when it came to anything remotely politically advantageous, to use excessive force when alternative negotiation methods might just as well have been expedient. Another domestic tragedy occurring on the Clinton watch was the Alfred P. Murrah building, allegedly at the hands of former military serviceman Timothy McVeigh. The tragedy was, in fact, according to the convicted bomber McVeigh, due to a large part at the Waco siege pulling off the explosion on the 2nd anniversary of the Waco incident, April 28, 95 exactly. At least 600 people were killed, and it was, up until then, the largest domestic terrorist event to hit American soil prior to the September 11th attacks. In spring, early 2000, National Security Advisor Sandy Berger alerted the president that the National Security Agency was becoming increasingly alarmed at the amount of chatter from the once allied terrorist Osama bin Laden, now actively and aggressively acting hostile to the American interests in Afghanistan, where he remained once the Mujahideen had successfully driven the Soviets out. Berger insisted that bin Laden was now decisively regarded as an enemy combatant, even though he was once an enthusiastic, friendly asset for more than 10-plus years, devoted to the expulsion of the Soviet aggression in Afghanistan. It remains to be unclear as to the reason Berger made his new organization, Al-Qaeda, an extremist terrorist organization, and persuaded the president to even launch several intercontinental ballistic missiles targeting several training operations of bin Laden, and an intelligence failure with several strikes on pharmaceutical company in Sudan. Berger insists it was a training operation. Over 50 terrorists' innocent lives were lost, and an international outrage ensued as a result. Just to finish up on the affair, Mr. Berger was arrested and searched in 2015 at the National Archives, trying to smuggle some confidential national security documents, and was stripped of his security clearance and fined $25,000. Mr. Berger made a public admission of guilt, but did not elaborate on the substance of what it was that he was attempting to take possession of. It seems quite clear to me that, as a side political historian, that Berger was working at the behest of the former president to try and cover up any connections he might have had with respect to September 11th, because Hillary's run for the White House could not afford to have questions that might indicate her husband may have had prior knowledge of the attacks. So he instructed Berger to smuggle the documents out of the National Archives, because the Clinton Library has still failed to release some 3 million documents as of 2015. So the only other repository would be the National Archives, but only someone with top secret clearance would be able to access it. So we pretty much covered the Clinton administration for all that it was. Just as a side note, to put some more emphasis on the unpleasant Janet Reno, there was also the incident with the Cuban refugee Elian Gonzalez in Miami, in which the ATF and the FBI stormed the home of the boy's father, and shots were fired, and then they ultimately returned him. Okay, wait for the next video for George W. Bush's administration. Bye.